Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you today to the Retired United interview series, our fifth in the series of interviews that we're conducting with eminent medical people right around the world. And today we are really privileged to have with us Professor Ajith Yoganathan. And I say really privileged partly for one reason as well. He is the son of our beloved Professor of Pathology, Professor Yoganathan, you may all remember. Now, Ajith did his BSc in chemical engineering at UCL in 1973, and then he completed a PhD at the California Institute of Technology on cardiovascular transport phenomena. He joined the academic staff at the Georgia Tech in 1979, and in fact founded the cardiovascular fluid mechanics lab, and is widely credited with inventing the science of prosthetic valve engineering. And in this lab, he has supervised over 50 PhD students, 35 MSc students, and 40 postdoctoral fellows at the last count. In 1988, he became professor of chemical engineering at the Georgia Tech. And in 2004, he was elevated to the state of Regents Professor in biomedical engineering in Georgia Tech and Emory University. Now, his academic achievements are legendary. He's published over 450 papers in peer-reviewed journals and written over 40 chapters in acclaimed textbooks. He's also the founding editor of the preeminent journal in his field, Cardiovascular Engineering and Technology. Now, amongst the many awards he's won are the following. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, the highest honor in the USA for practicing engineers, in 2015. And most recently, in 2020, he was honored with an inaugural honorary fellowship from the American Association of Thoracic Surgeons. And ladies and gentlemen, you'll know why when we go through this interview. He also has many other awards like the H.R. Lisner Award in Bioengineering, the Theo Pilkington Award in from the American Society of Engineering Education, and the Pritzker Lecturer Award for Biomedical Engineering. Currently, he is the chair of the cardiovascular subcommittee of the International Standards Organization on Implants for Surgery. He has over 20 patents, and you'll be impressed to know that all cardiac valves in use today have been evaluated in a CFM lab, and that is the approval site for the FDA for all cardiac implantation devices. I hope I haven't missed out anything, Ajith.
No, that is very nicely done, Guerra.
Ajith, I want to start off the interview by asking you an obvious question. You are from a medical family. Your father was a doctor, and your mother was the professor of pathology. Why did you not do medicine?
Well, good question. Yes, not only my mother and father, had uncles, aunts, and a whole series of people who were doctors in different things. I always used to go with my mother to the medical school on vacation days or weekends and sit in the pathology lab and look at all these samples, hearts, fetuses, all preserved in formalin. So I was always fascinated by medicine, but I never liked biology. I thought biology was too much of memorization and didn't, at least those days, that's what it was. I liked math and I liked chemistry, so I decided I would go into chemical engineering. So that was the reason I got in there. But medicine has always been in my background. And so when I got an opportunity to get into the area, I found it fascinating.
Right. So that sets the record straight. But if you didn't want to do medicine, why did you choose biomedical engineering?
So that again is one of these stories when things happen that you don't plan on. You plan to do one thing, and I have this slide from Winnie the Pooh that says, where he says he tells I think Eeyore, hey, when we get out of this pit, let's not look for it, uh, and let's look for something else. And the reason, he says, so you ask him, why do you want to do this? He says, well, when you keep looking for something you want, you never find it. And you run across things that you don't expect. And that's something that you don't expect may be what is more exciting than what you were really wanting to find. So when I left London in '73, I came back after finishing. I went back to Sri Lanka for a couple of months on vacation because I hadn't been back since I came to London in 1970. And then in September of '73, went to Caltech to do my PhD. My plan was to work in air pollution because they had a strong research group in that field. And that's what I had planned to do. But you have the professors who get up and give like half an hour talks about their research activities. And this professor, Bill Cochran, got up and talked about the Krotkoff sound, which you know is what the sound you get with the blood pressure cuff. And he related that to blood flowing through a constriction. And that was the first time I'd even linked those two together. And he said, I'm interested in understanding this phenomena. And he had some other problems he was interested in. That was the first time I ever was exposed to anything that was engineering related to medicine. And so I went and talked to him. He was interested in having engineers look at blood flow related problems in the heart. And that's how I got involved.
Right. Yeah. So why did you concentrate on the heart then eventually?
So again, another thing by chance, we were working on Krotkoff sounds, and actually he was working with a cardiologist who was also interested in looking at the other things that you listen with the stethoscope flow through your heart and heart valves, and looking at aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation, where you get the whoosh whoosh sound that you pick up on the stethoscope. And we were doing some analysis on that. And we had published a paper when he got a call from a cardiologist at the USC Los Angeles County Medical Center, which is one of the biggest medical centers in the country, especially on the West Coast. And this was Dr. Earl Harrison. And Earl was running a large heart valve clinic. And he approached us and said, hey, can you use these techniques of sound analysis to look at failing mechanical heart valves, these heart valves that thrombose, could you be able to tell? And that opened up a whole vast arena, and that's how I got into the area of heart valves and heart disease.
Right. Okay. And now you worked on the heart and congenital heart disease extensively. That's been your life.
Right.
Now, looking back as an engineer, do you think the heart is perfectly designed?
Well, I don't know what you would call perfectly, but I think it's designed better than we as human beings can engineer things. I think when we look at a lot of our organ systems, there's a lot of intriguing engineering that goes into it. As we know, the heart is an electromechanical pump. It takes cellular activity that creates electrical activity that causes the contraction and pumping of blood. But one of the fascinating things about the heart is how well it's designed and how much safety is built into it. It's actually over-designed, so it takes a lot before it has problems or things go into failure. For example, the mitral valve, and one of the main areas that I worked in is understanding mitral regurgitation, leaking through the mitral valve. And it takes about an 80% change in its anatomic characteristics before it fails. So there's so much redundancy built into it. And it is fascinating. And I think that's where it is challenging for us as humans to design something as efficient as the human heart. And it is an extremely efficient pump. It only pumps for about 1/3 of the heart per heartbeat, which is really amazing. And it gets out about 5 to 10 liters of blood per minute under those conditions. So it is an amazing device.
Right. So you seem to think that it is more or less perfectly designed, Ajit. That's what I'm getting from your
Well,
answer.
yeah. Well, it's designed by someone higher up than us.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. I believe so too. Now, you have worked on pediatric heart disease, and that's been a large part of your career as well.
Right.
And you looked at these children with single ventricles. And in
Mhm.
fact, you and another cardiac surgeon, if I'm right, devised an operation based on some of your work and some planning that you did jointly. Can you tell us something about single ventricles and your work with them?
Yes. So here again was an area that I knew very little about. When I was doing, obviously, my work at Caltech was on aortic valves, and I came to Georgia Tech to start my academic career in June of 1979. And one of the first people that summer I met over at the medical school at Emory University, which is a private medical school in Atlanta, because Georgia Tech is pretty much a technology-based engineering school, does not have medicine. Went to talk with him. His name was Robert French, and we developed a research collaboration. And one day, a few years later, we were talking about a variety of things over a glass of beer, and he said, how come you haven't expressed you don't want to look at the pulmonic valve? And I said, normally in adults, the pulmonic valve is fine, it doesn't happen. And he said, yes, but he said, I'm taking care of a lot of young or babies and young children who have pulmonic stenosis and have also this disease called tetralogy of Fallot, which is a disease of 4 different things that affect the right heart. And I said, yes, is that so? So we got into the area of pediatric valve disease. Then in 1983, we wrote a small grant and got things started. And about a decade later, I think around about 1995, we were also then starting to collaborate with a pediatric cardiologist at the Children's Hospital associated with Emory. And he talked to me about this whole area of single ventricles. And that has been an area of much passion to me because it is amazing what we can do for these babies that are born with essentially what I call a functioning half a heart, and correct things, palliate them, and get them to go. And today, many of them live 20 years, 30 years, even 40 years. And because the surgical techniques have improved, the imaging techniques have improved, and we've used imaging and computer simulation to plan surgical operations for these kids. You mentioned the surgeon that we worked with and come up with a surgical option. It's called the Y-graft. It's Kirk Cantor, who was the chief of pediatric heart surgery here at Emory. He just stepped down, but he's still active. And we worked with surgeons of 3 of the major hospitals on the East Coast of the United States, Atlanta, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Boston Children's Hospital, and done work. We even have interacted with Great Ormond Street Hospital as well. So this area has been fascinating to me, and it is an area of true passion because I say if you can save a life at birth, it's a lot, not that I say you shouldn't save someone at 95, but you're giving someone a long runway of being productive.
True. Thanks, Ajit. Now, getting back to your work with heart valves, what did you find so interesting in the structure and function of heart valves? Why did you spend so much time looking at these valves?
So one of the things that I found out early on in our work was why was there a need for these devices? I mean, obviously at that time in 1970, 74, 75, when I was starting my PhD work, everything was a mechanical valve. There's a ball and cage valve. There's something like a tilting disc, something that opened and closed like a toilet seat, literally. And then there was a bileaflet valve. I was wondering why surgery for these? And I started researching and found out valvular heart disease, which is very prevalent even today in Sri Lanka, India, places. I don't like to call anyone third world countries, developing countries or things like that. China, where there's a lot of rheumatic heart disease that leads to valvular heart disease. is there is no cure for valvular heart disease. There is no magic pill you can take. We can take a pill, a cholesterol reducing tablet. We can take a statin to control cholesterol and reduce arteries being blocked for valves. There is no medical therapy. And I soon found out from an engineering point of view, when the valve becomes about 50% less efficient in getting blood flow in its unidirectional fashion, as it's supposed to, you're in big trouble. You're going to need replacement, because if you don't, you're ultimately going to die. So to me, that's what got me really fascinated by this area. We're creating these devices. How can we better design them? How can we make sure they last a lifetime? Because sometimes some people as young as 10, 15 years get these valves. Even though today it is more, in the Western world, it's more prevalent in older people, we still have young adults who need valves. And so we need devices that last a long time. And understanding the structure and function of native valves will eventually lead us to design better, whether they be mechanical valves or biological valves or anything, because we need that basic understanding.
Yeah. Now, obviously, if you implant a valve in a heart, there is an increased risk of thrombosis related to the valve. Is there any chance that biomedical engineers can invent a valve with no thrombotic risk?
I think there is. Obviously, blood doesn't like to see foreign materials. Anytime that's natural reaction, it causes a cascade of the platelets to protect the body. It's a defense mechanism. It's also a healing mechanism. And most of the materials we have used today are fairly materials that have come out of other areas of engineering. I think material science is evolving today with nanotechnology and things like that, that we could come up with things that may not need as much treatment to control thromboembolic complications. I think the challenge is, can we come up with the material and come up with a valve design with the appropriate material where the patient will not need any kind of anticoagulation? Because today, these patients are on some kind of anticoagulation therapy. The question is, can they, and it's a lifelong thing if you have a mechanical valve, can you do it at a lower dose and maybe only take a tablet once a week? That would be ideal. Or can we even self-titrate that anticoagulation like we do for patients who self-titrate their glucose levels? And I think that's clearly an area that people are working in. People are looking at polymeric valves. I'm working right now with a company in Utah that is developing, it's doing an initial clinical study with some polymers. And actually, one of the people who invented that polymer is a Sri Lankan in Australia. So it's a small world.
It is. It is. All right. That's interesting. Now, the other way of not running this risk of thrombotic disease with a foreign valve is inventing a tissue valve, if you like, within inverted commas. Is there a biomedical method of inventing a tissue valve rather than getting it from an animal donor?
So if you look at the history of valves even in the 60s, surgeons tried all sorts of human tissues to make valves out of, fascial lata, things like that, mucosa from the gut, things like that. So there was always a fascination of using biological materials. And then what we landed on is either using porcine valves, the aortic valve taken from the pig, because as it turns out, the anatomy of the pig, the aortic anatomy is fairly similar to human, believe it or not. I mean, the other animals that would be apes and gorillas, but you're not going to go after getting valves out of them. Or the kangaroo, that's the other animal that also has a heart about the same size. So porcine valves have been used, but obviously being from another species, you want to be careful that you don't introduce any viruses and any other things to the human body. And so they are fixed in glutaldehyde. So they're cross-linked. And as you know, we preserve organs in formaldehyde. Actually, initially, people used formaldehyde, and then they found that was more toxic, so they went to glutaldehyde and essentially cross-linked the collagen. In about 1975, people also found that we could do the same to the pericardium taken from calves, the bovine pericardium. You can get sheets of material and mount it on a stent, man-made stent. But these were also fixed in glutaldehyde. Because of the fact these are fixed in glutaldehyde, they're like tan shoe leather. And we know our shoes don't last a lifetime. They come apart, the leather comes apart. So these valves have a lifetime, maybe somewhere in the aortic position today, maybe 15 years, 20 years before they fall apart and need replacement. And then in the mitral position, which is under higher pressures, they last maybe 7 or 8. So that's where we are. There's a whole area of, can we tissue engineer a valve? Can we grow a valve? And that area of research has been going on for the last maybe 2 decades. But progress has been extremely slow because we have had very little understanding of how our native valves are made of different cells, different tissue types, and how they regenerate themselves. So our valves are living tissue. I mean, they open and close 40 million times a year, and they continue to work. So, and I think that's where we are trying to understand that. That together with understanding why valvular disease happens at a cell and molecular level, and because then maybe treatments are possible rather than even coming up with a valve, because I think eventually it would be nice if you can diagnose someone early on with valvular heart disease and put them on medical therapy.
Right, so that there is hope then.
Well, I think there is a lot of research, and I think that research got started later than earlier, because you'd say then how come for atherosclerosis we have these statins, all of that. I think the fact that valve surgery started in 1960 with the advent of open heart surgery and was very successful overall. I mean, yes, it saved millions of lives. People just didn't get into the area of doing research on fundamental research, basic research that was needed. That has started, I would say, in the last 25 years. One of the leading people in this field is someone I have worked with and collaborated with, Sir Magdi Yaqub in London. He has been, even as a surgeon, he has a very scientific bent towards these things, and he has been looking at things at a very scientific level, because eventually that's what we need, medical options.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, Ajith. Now, the other issue about, and you alluded to this, is that if you want to give a person a new valve, you got to actually operate on him for most valves, and you've got to have open heart surgery. Although it's more or less routine now, patients get worried about this. Patients' families get worried about it. Do you foresee a situation where all valves, under all circumstances, can be introduced, a kind of transcatheter valve implantation or something like that, without recourse to open heart surgery?
You're absolutely right. I mean, when the whole area of heart valve surgery came on board, only after the heart-lung machine had been developed, which was in around about 58, 59. The first valve was implanted in an orthotopic position in 1960 by Al Starr. Before that, for example, to correct aortic regurgitation, they would implant a ball and cage valve in the descending thoracic aorta, because you didn't need to you didn't have to stop the beating heart. So you did it there. And so that flourished. And then in the last 2 decades, there has been a lot of effort to say, okay, we can put stents into the coronary arteries. Can we get a valve on a stent and deploy it? And I think in 2004, the first one was done by Dr. Alain Cribier in France. was the first 80-odd-year-old lady who had no other choice, and he tried it out. It worked in principle. And since then, especially the last 10 years in Europe and the US, there's been a whole explosion of valves for the aortic positions, transcatheter aortic valves, but mainly focused on calcific aortic stenosis, because you're deploying a device that you're now trying to anchor through a catheter without an open chest and without the surgeon trying to sew the valve in. So you have certain characteristics that you need. And now there's a push on doing the same for the mitral and tricuspid. And then some pediatric, the Melody valve, which came out also around about 2010, 2012 from Great Ormond Street to treat tetralogy of Fallot. So in principle, all 4 valves can be treated with transcatheter valves. There are clearly challenges in all different positions. The aortic valve probably is the most straightforward because the disease, aortic stenosis, is the most rampant, and you have the calcium where you can anchor onto. People who have bicuspid aortic valves and those are more challenging there to implant these devices. But no matter what, where the real challenge is, the tissues that are being used are the same tissues that are being used with surgical valves. So if you put a transcatheter valve in the aortic position, maybe you'll get 10 years, 12 years. Then what do? You have to go back in. They've said you can do a valve-in-valve, which is like a Russian doll where you put dolls one another, but then you narrow the flow area eventually. And can you go then and surgically remove that? That would be a huge challenge. So people are looking at other ways. Can we do, when we implant these valves, can we do some other surgery through the catheter robotically or things like that? I have a colleague here in Atlanta at Emory, Dr. Babliaros, who's a wizard with catheter-generated things, and he's looking at cutting leaflets and doing things. Eventually, I would say 20, 30 years down the road, I think all valves will be implanted transcatheter, and we would rely only on bypass surgery-related valve replacements in a very small subset of patients.
Ajith, that's been a fascinating overview of your work and some of the stuff that interests you in biomedical engineering relating to the heart. But what is, in your view, the future for biomedical engineering in terms of the heart? What's the next best big thing?
Well, there's a lot of things going on. This whole area of structural heart and doing things minimally invasively is a huge area, and that needs engineers to work closely with clinicians because these are man-made devices. As you know, the other area is that, and as you mentioned, your son is working on assist devices. As people live longer and your heart has been ravaged by disease, you sometimes, or many people end up with heart failure. And then what do you do there? Unfortunately, transplant is a good option, but there are a limited number of hearts available anywhere in the world. Can we come up with a xenograft heart? Maybe, but there's that whole area of left ventricular assist device or support or total artificial heart, where again, it's a huge area for engineers. And I think engineers are also making contributions in trying to understand what I call valve biology, valve mechanics, so we can get a better understanding. And I have colleagues who work more on the biological side of things, engineers who are more interested on the biological level so that one day we might come up with treatment. So there's a lot of things that are heart related that biomedical engineers and engineers as a whole can contribute. Another area is to put these valves on a catheter and deliver them. You need very good imaging techniques, right? Because you don't have the open access, open chest that the surgeon has and has his eyes glued onto the heart and has his hands in there. So you need good imaging tools, either CT driven, MRI driven, and there's a lot of technology development there as well that engineers are playing a big role in. And also robotics. because some of these things could help the interventional cardiologist or the surgeon do things robotically. Robotic mitral valve surgery is done in a few places quite successfully. And that again minimizes trauma because it is minimally invasive and does assist the surgeon rather than having to have a fully open chest.
Right, that's interesting, Ajith. We're getting to the end, but I want to ask you, if you've had a career as productive and as distinguished as yours, there must have been somebody or several people who inspired you. Are you able to tell me who they were?
So when I look back, I was always, I guess, not why I got into the biomedical field, but when I look back and say why I'm passionate about it is both my parents, I think, inspired me there. My father was a private practitioner, and I used to make my money by answering his phone calls. I expected this thing 25 cents. But what really amazed me about him was if anyone called him at midnight or 2 in the morning, he would still go. Now, he wouldn't drive by himself. He said, send a car or something, I'll go, this thing. And I was just amazed by his passion for taking care of his patients and also how much he knew about his patients. And when he passed away in 93, luckily I was there, got back in time before he passed away. At his funeral, there were sometimes 3 generations of the family were there. Grandmother, daughter, and granddaughter. So he had treated, and that really inspired me in this. And then obviously my mother. The person who probably got me really going in this area in terms of the biomedical engineering was Bill Cochran, my former mentor at Caltech, and Earl Harrison, the cardiologist. Those 2 guys were just amazing in terms of the large vision on how engineers could work with doctors, because at that time that wasn't a practice. We're talking 1975. Doctors lived in a different area, engineers different, talk different languages, but the ability to collaborate and respect each other was something I learned from them.
Right. Now, for a man who's achieved so much, I hate to ask this question, but do you think you have any weaknesses?
I would say no. No. So the one weakness I have, we'll start off with that. I like single malt scotch. My wife says that's my major weakness.
I'm sure many in our audience will identify with that weakness, Ajith.
I'm sure you guys do. Probably the thing is, I tend to be impatient to get us to move things forward. So as my trainees will say, I push them hard. At times, that's, I think, consider that a weakness. I also like to look at the big picture and look at the translation. I don't like to get into the nitty-gritty details. I say, okay, I will orchestrate that. You guys have to implement it. And sometimes that could be considered a fault or a weakness. But overall, I think if I had to redo things, I probably wouldn't do it any differently in terms of how I approach my research career.
Excellent. Now, one final question. Now, I've been out of Sri Lanka for 40 years, and you told me that you celebrated your 50th year out of Sri Lanka last week or week before.
About a month ago, yes.
A month ago. Do you miss Sri Lanka?
I miss Sri Lanka, yes. So I left in September of 1970. Actually, there was 3 of us who left on the same plane, and that was an adventure too. It was 2 weeks after the bombing of planes that had been hijacked by Black September. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I remember that, yes.
So myself, Kumar Mahadeva, and then N.K. De Silva, who was probably your classmate.
My classmate, yes.
So those 2, and then Ranil Pereira, he wasn't on that flight, but all 4 of us were going that year. Those 3 were going to Cambridge. I was going to UCL. And so we left, the 3 of us left on the same plane. We had to stop BOAC at that time. We stopped in Cairo, and they wouldn't allow us to get down. For 4 hours, we were in this plane, no air conditioning. And I get to London. My uncle met us and took us around. He was a Don at Cambridge, Viswan Navaratnam, who was my mother's younger brother,
Right.
the anatomy professor at Cambridge.
Yeah.
So yes, I left, and after that, I only came back in '73 for a brief break, and I've been back and forth. I do miss a lot of my classmates, but as it turns out, many of them are also all over the world. So, and similar for my family, but it would be nice to get back every now. I mean, I do try to get back, but I don't think I would have gone back to work there because I don't think the career opportunities would have been there.
Ajith, I'm really grateful to you for spending such a long time with us and for giving us a bit of your fascinating story. And I'm truly appreciative of that on behalf of our group and our website, the retiredunited.com website, to give its full name. And thank you very much.